the first annual Montgomery Burns Award for outstanding achievement in the field of excellence.
Welcome to a special bonus episode of Three Brothers Filmcast. This February marked the 10th anniversary of our launch of the website, and as a commemoration, we've been sharing some of our film writing from the last decade. But we've also been working on something extra special to mark this occasion, the Three Brothers Film Top 100. I'm Anders Bergstrom, here with my brothers,
Anton.
And Aaron.
My last name is the same as my brother's.
And in this bonus episode, we're going to talk about the process and results of our Top 100 list. So, to kick things off, let's take a look at the top 10 here.
So if you want to see the full 100, you're going to have to look at the website. The full list is published on there. However, just to kick things off, let's actually look at the top 10. So, and number 10 is Return of the Jedi from 1983, directed by Richard Marquand. Number 9 is Citizen Kane from 1941, directed by Orson Welles. Number 8 is It's a Wonderful Life from 1946, directed by Frank Capra. Number 7 is Lawrence of Arabia from 1962, directed by David Lean. Number 6 is Seven Samurai from 1954, directed by Akira Kurosawa. Number 5 is Psycho from 1960, directed by Alfred Hitchcock. Number 4 is The Empire Strikes Back from 1980, directed by Irvin Kershner. Number 3 is Star Wars, or A New Hope, from 1977, directed by George Lucas. Number 2 is Raiders of the Lost Ark from 1981, directed by Steven Spielberg. Coming in at the number 1 slot is 2001: A Space Odyssey from 1968, directed by Stanley Kubrick.
Wait a second. I voted for the Gus Van Sant Psycho, so I don't understand why it's not in the top 10.
Yeah, and it should be Rise of Skywalker at number 10.
Oh, gosh.
So you can see we each get our favorite Star Wars in the top 10. Mine's A New Hope.
Yeah, so as you can see from the top 10, here's the thing. So we're going to get into the methodology in a moment, but just so you know, this top 10 was formulated by all of our picks coming together, and it actually is very representative of our kind of unified taste, not only of movies we all individually love, as Anton said, each of our individual favorite Star Wars movies on here. So Star Wars is Anton's favorite, Empire Strikes Back is Anders' favorite, Return of the Jedi is my favorite. All those are in the top 10. Then also, of course, Steven Spielberg with Raiders, 2001: Space Odyssey, the kind of consensus choice for the best science fiction film, which we don't necessarily count Star Wars as science fiction. Seven Samurai, so that's Kurosawa, kind of looms so large in our early cinephile years, and even lately, Lawrence of Arabia for the epic and the kind of peak of classical large-scale filmmaking. It's a Wonderful Life, which is the movie we all usually watch at Christmas. And Citizen Kane is just kind of that old standard, which I know, Anton, before you've kind of brought up that it's the kind of film that it's always bandied about as like the textbook definition of the best movie or the ideal Hollywood movie, but that kind of hides the fact of just how damn entertaining it is.
Yeah, it actually is the correct answer. I think that was a Roger Ebert actually line, right? He'd always be like, the correct answer to the greatest film is Citizen Kane.
And, I think it's also like the directors, like having Hitchcock come in the top 10 was really important there as well.
So would 2001 be any of our individual pick for the top, or was that more the consensus of all of us think it's so excellent and that pushed it to the top?
Let me put it this way, Mr. Raymer. The 9000 series is the most reliable computer ever made. No 9000 computer has ever made a mistake or distorted information. We are all, by any practical definition of the words, foolproof and incapable of error.
I always waffle between whether 2001 or Empire Strikes Back is my favorite movie of all time.
Okay, so those are
close,
the two.
It's hard to pick between because Empire's been my favorite for so long since I was a child that it would be hard to say. But if someone was wanting my answer for some of the more formal possibilities of cinema as a modern art form, I think I'd point to 2001 in a lot of ways as well. So
like I've always said, and I've written this on the website. My two favorite films are Star Wars: A New Hope and Lawrence of Arabia. But 2001 would be, maybe third, maybe fourth, maybe fifth, depending on my ranking.
Do you know what's really interesting there is that there are some interesting, like, sort of formal similarities between those two films. Because Star Wars and Lawrence of Arabia, you mentioned in your piece that you did for the intro to our retrospective on Star Wars, you mentioned that fact that Star Wars and Lawrence of Arabia...
The piece called Growing Up on Tatooine.
Yeah, the deserts and all those kind of things, right?
Yeah.
And I noticed, like, there's scenes in, like, Empire Strikes Back, like, even that mirror some of, like, the modernism of 2001: A Space Odyssey. Like, there's even a scene on Cloud City when Luke Skywalker goes down through the tubes and it lights up around. It's very similar to the access on the Discovery in 2001: A Space Odyssey and things like that. So there's, like, interesting little formal similarities of some shots in those films. So it's interesting pairings for us in that way.
I think the other funny thing is that so many of these directors of so if you take these all these movies in this top 10 or in the larger 100, the films that are made earlier would probably be the favorite films of the filmmakers who made the films later too. Like, you know what I mean? Like Spielberg and Scorsese and Lucas love Kurosawa, love Hitchcock.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah.
Love Kubrick. Like, so
John Ford, Searchers.
Exactly. Lucas would admit that he's stealing from 2001, and Spielberg would admit he's taken from John Ford, and it's just these kind of pile up.
Scorsese and Schrader were stealing from the Searchers, Taxi Driver.
Exactly.
And so you can see the personal side of this list, because what we were also doing is, I think a lot of our taste in film grew out from things like Lucas and Spielberg, and then into what their sources and the material they were drawing on. Like, I know for myself, like, my interest in Kurosawa came from my interest first encountering Star Wars as a kid, and then being like, well, what were the movies he was watching and loved? And then you go and watch Hidden Fortress and Seven Samurai, and so it's interesting to see how the connections that the filmmakers saw among their works is something that we've sort of appreciated.
Absolutely. I'd have to go back and somehow, I don't think I can confirm it, but I'm pretty sure that Kurosawa's films were probably the first foreign films, like non-Anglo or American films that I've ever seen.
I'd seen Kurosawa for, like, serious films, I guess, would be, like, the first foreign films that are really engaged with, but obviously I was watching Jackie Chan movies.
But not me.
Yeah.
Because I'm 8 years old.
There's enough of an age gap, yeah.
So when I got to watching Jackie Chan, I was already like 12, 13. Right?
Yeah, and my interest in,
I'm
like...
pretty sure I watched Seven Samurai or Hidden Samurai when I was like 9 or 10.
And watching some of, like, the old Westerns, that also sort of bridged out from Star Wars for me. Lawrence of Arabia, like, I'd seen it on TV, like, parts of it, and then I had to track down the double disc VHS, or sorry, not disc, the double cartridge, like, VHS, plug that in for 4 hours. Well, so Aaron, you didn't say, how highly would, if you were doing an individual list, 2001, would that be in your top couple?
No.
Or few? No.
So 2001 is, like, firmly in my top 10, but it's not in my top couple. I probably have the most idiosyncratic top 5 of us three. Partially of my love of Studio Ghibli movies. And, like, I would have Spirited Away as the movie that would be kind of contending with Return of the Jedi for the best movie ever. And quickly after that, I would have Blue Velvet and Ben-Hur really close. And I know you guys like those movies and they're on this list, but they're not best film of all time kind of material.
Yeah, the one that for me is edging into top film of all time territory, and I would probably at this point put it in my top 5 all time, is actually the My Neighbor Totoro. So,
which is on the list, and I really appreciate it. And so that's the kind of thing that you're getting where you gravitate towards Totoro partially because of your experience, re-experiencing it through your kids, and it gives you a new lens and a new appreciation of just how, like, amazing that is. While Spirited Away is this film that I remember watching it in probably early 2002 on DVD, and kind of when you guys were working at Blockbuster, I believe, and watching it and kind of re-watching it, and it wasn't my favorite. At the time, I remember thinking Princess Mononoke was like far and away the coolest, just because it's so violent and it's got the samurai aspects to it. But Spirited Away is that kind of film which, the more I rewatched it, the more it grows, and it starts to get this really strong hold on the imagination. And as a writer or as a person who makes short films and tries to fuel my creative side with these movies I engage with, something like Spirited Away is complete fuel to the imagination, where I watch it and it makes me jump off in a million different directions of the stories that I tell. So like something like that, it's the repetition is like it branches off further and further. And it's a completely different movie, but like Blue Velvet, another one of my favorites, is a movie that I liked the first time I saw it. But then the second time I saw it, it like was a completely new experience. And then the third time, and you start to realize how much the movie itself has to do with watching movies and like putting yourself in the lives of others. And Vertigo, which is on this list further down, has a bit of that too, right? With, I think people who are interested in movies as the formative stories they take in gravitate towards certain movies which dig into that like artistic or creative imagination.
I think it's also notable then that how our top 10, the most recent film on that list is Return of the Jedi. Mm-hmm. So it's definitely skews older. And then if you move a little bit down, for those of you looking at the larger top 100, Spirited Away is the first film in the last, I guess at this point, 20 years that appears on the list.
Yeah, and so the first from the 21st century.
Yep.
Maybe one other comment about the top 10 I'd point out. Just to, like we mentioned, It's a Wonderful Life is something we always watch at Christmas, but I think when I was rewatching it this year with Anders, I'd point out that like I think each of us does actually think it's like an excellent movie. It's not just something we watch at Christmas, but when I was watching it, I was struck by how in the first few scenes of that film, Capra is telling so much about a person's youth, but you realize you're like, oh, there's actually only like a few scenes. It's not even like a montage of like parts of his life. He's just constructed scenes so well that a handful of scenes tells like on a broad scope, like so much about his upbringing. And that whole film works in such a, like we often talk about Citizen Kane as the story of a man's life and how expert it is, but It's a Wonderful Life is also such a good story of a man's life.
Yeah. On our first episode, I think when we were talking about Mank, I believe we mentioned that fact, that the line from Kane, maybe nothing can a story evoke an entire person's life.
Yeah.
But I do think It's a Wonderful Life does that, and so to me, it stands up there as like a great novel in terms of the way it's able to paint a picture not only of actually one man but a whole community, I think.
And I think your comment, Anton, about rewatching this at Christmas, it's not so much that this list is just like our pet favorites. And obviously the fact that there's Star Wars on here, it means that they're the films we're most passionate about. It's the films we will go up to bat for, right? Like, we know inside and out, and we can discuss the reasons why not only they mean so much to us individually within our own life experience of watching it, our own childhood of their first encounters, repetition encounters, and how they influenced us in what we do or what we're interested in, but also kind of taught us the language to engage with other movies. Yeah. And in which, by giving those tools to go investigate samurai movies or old westerns or old Hollywood classics or silent films, and then you double back and you revisit that initial film, it deepens your enjoyment of it, and you start to realize that, oh wait, we're actually just really lucky that some of the films that we latched onto in childhood happen to be really great films that are very instructive in how to understand and appreciate classical Hollywood filmmaking. Because that is the other thing. All these movies on the top 10, they're classical films. We don't have any real...
Well, I guess 2001 is Space Odyssey.
It's the closest, yeah.
It would be the most experimental
it is,
of them
but
all. Even though it has some of...
It's still conventionally appealing. The end sequence is experimental, but we don't have any slow cinema on here. We don't have any really like patience pushing avant-garde stuff. We don't have things that break down into a pure formalist sense of like, we don't have Godard, we don't have some of those new wave guys across various national cinemas. And it's not to say anything against them. It's just the fact that I think at its core, we do align with the most effective way a film can connect with you is on the narrative level and on the emotional level, in addition, and using all those formal tools to create that. And which is why it's actually very appropriate for something like 2001 to be at the top, even though I wouldn't, say it's my first or second film all time. And it's because it unifies the craft and the use of narrative and just the kind of emotional and sensory experience of cinema in such a way that it gives you something you can't get in a book. And I really like Arthur C. Clarke books. I've read all the Odyssey books. They're great books, but it's a completely different experience than watching that movie, especially watching it in a theater in 70 mil.
Well, I think the film is the superior. I've read, all
absolutely.
that series. I think the film is the superior work.
Well,
actually,
those
though.
also aren't his best books. Like
Yeah.
some of his other books, like Childhood's End, are better.
But I thought you point out an interesting and important observation about the whole list is that you do see that we do, all of us, as this is a work of consensus. This is our interest in or our emphasis on narrative in film comes strong. Even though each of us has other aspects of film, I think we each skew more towards whether how much we care about genre conventions, how much we care about certain formal aspects or visual aspects, or the use of sound or music. But there's definitely you'd look at this list and you'd see that these are these are people who are very interested in how you tell a story, and then that's maybe the central thing that film is a narrative medium.
I think though that also though like you mentioned both of you earlier, the classical sense, in that classical Hollywood style, in a sense, right? Whether as maybe if it's laid down in the codes laid down in the 20s and 30s that maybe perfected by people like John Ford, that people like Lucas and even as early as Citizen Kane. There's a quote of Orson Welles, and they asked him, it's like, which masters did you study when you wanted to learn how to make Citizen Kane? And his joke answer, but as a serious answer, was John Ford, John Ford, and John Ford. So he said apparently he watched Stagecoach over and over again in order to learn a lot of the basics in the move from stage and radio to cinema for him.
No, I was saying, Anton, you mentioned this as a work of collaboration and a consensus list. So, Anders, maybe do you want to jump into the methodology of how we actually broke down this list?
I don't know. I'm making this up as I go.
Yeah, so methods for list making are always, the method that you use to create the list is going to inform the kind of list you get.
And we didn't want to put out just 3 lists, because we mentioned what some of our individual tops would be. But we were looking for something for the site, right? For the Three Brothers.
The interesting thing about the site is that it's this weird it's drawing on our various idiosyncrasies and our shared aspects and presenting it to the world in this kind of unified tone or voice, even if we, have all these various differences between us. So it was important to have a list from the Three Brothers, not 3 lists from the brothers.
And so that informed my sort of trying to come up with the methodology here. So there was a couple challenges. One is limited pool of voters, which is 3, so you're going to get a lot of ties. The second thing is that if each person just submitted a ranked list and you found the consensus of that, it would be possible for someone to skew the list to get some of their own pet favorites that aren't even maybe liked or admired by the others.
Or seen, even.
Or even seen, into the top 10. So what we did was I had each of us submit, without seeing what the other brothers did, submit a nomination list of 100 films. So
unranked and
what we ended
just
up,
a list.
Unranked list of 100 films that you would nominate for the top 100. And I put no limits on that. So there wasn't any limits about how many films by a director or decade or anything like that. Just give me a list of your 100 films. From that, we came up with a pool of actually 194 different films nominated by the 3 of us. So that meant that what actually ended up being was that each of us had about 50% overlap with the other
But
two.
a 50% not overlap.
But 50% non-overlap, which is, I think, pretty good. So that would still mean, though, that you have essentially an overlap of about 100 and, some films in there, and trying to work out what those would be and the ranks. So then what I had each of us do was to vote on those and vote them very specifically. Not just I instructed my brothers to not just rate it what you think it is, like a 10 out of 10 all time or a 5 out of 10, but rather rank it for the purposes of this list.
So it was 1 to
this-
6.
1 to 6, this film should be in the top 25, into the top 45, in the top 100, or just misses the cut, or I don't think it should be on the list, basically. And then there was a 1 if you were like, I'd be upset. And I will acknowledge my debt in terms of that ranking that to Darren Hughes and the folks over at Arts and Faith when they did their top 100 ranking, because I felt there's the one important thing about that methodology was it forced people to be very specific about what they wanted on and off the list, and 2, it avoided any ties. There was no middle value, right? So someone had to make a hard decision about is it on the list or off the list, right? So 4-3, that was the tipping point. So after we did that voting, we actually ended up with mostly a pretty good list of about 100 films, but given the nature of only having 3 voters, there were a lot of ties. We actually ended up having 8 films that received unanimous 6s across the board from all 3 of us. And then, so within each of those tiers that developed, and then had each of us submit rankings of those individual tiers. So you preserved the overall vote.
The things
for each
that have
film.
100% consensus, the things that have, close to 100%. So the top of the list means that all of us were very passionate about it being towards the top of the list.
So you get different levels that are the 6, the 5, the 4. Like you had grades of movies that fit it.
And that meant that, but then after that, each of us would offer a numbered rank of
In
those
order to
because,
iron out the ties and
in order to iron out the ties and stuff. And that also, forced people to rank films that maybe they even wouldn't have had in their top 100. So, and I think that I'm pretty happy. I remember when I showed it to you guys, what were your first thoughts when you saw it initially?
Well, I remember Anton's messages being, wait, did you guys not all give Citizen Kane in the top 10? Wait, did you guys not all put Godfather in the top 20? Wait, guys, why is Schindler's List not on your list?
Yeah, I was expecting Citizen Kane. Honestly, I was expecting Citizen Kane in the top 5 based on our normal conversations and how often we reference it. We hadn't actually talked about The Godfather in a while, but I think over the years, I probably feel more passionately about it than either of you. And Schindler's List, yeah, I mean, it's still on the list, but it's lower down. It's one of my top Spielbergs. So I fired off some nitpicking texts, chiding them for their...
But you also commented, Anton, that you were like, when you sat and looked at the top, especially once we did the ranking that sorted out kind of the top 25, top 30, you were like, you know what, this looks right. It feels right. It felt like, yeah, this is representative of all of us. There's no real films on there that any of us would be like, really?
Yeah,
That in our
and
top
I think
30,
if you look at if you're reading on the site, our feature on this, you're going to see how often we're pulling from our previous writing on the site, in order to describe the film. So many of these films are things we've already written about because we're passionate about them, and if we haven't. I think some of these ones, The Godfather, one of my top films. I need to watch it again because it's actually been a while. So I'd like to write on it for the site. But I think it's a good representative.
But I was pretty happy for an ad hoc methodology that was in attempting to solve certain problems, which is to avoid any one person being able to essentially game the list, to aim for consensus, to then also give it a fairly strong representation of our actual preferences by the subsequent ranking. I think it actually turned out pretty well. And it was funny because I will note when the first, obviously you can look at the list and I said there was 8 films that got unanimous 6. That means that it was 2001: Space Odyssey through It's a Wonderful Life, which all those tied at perfect 6 score. But then when we did the final ranking, I think the 2 films that Anton and I would have been disappointed not to have Kane in the top 10, definitely. And Aaron would have been really disappointed not to have his personal favorite film in the top 10. So I was really happy the way it shook out in terms of that being finalizing out.
It corrected for itself.
Exactly. And so to me, the fact that the methodology corrected for that makes me satisfied.
Oh, yeah, it worked. But it's actually interesting because, as you said, that there's a space for certain things that didn't make it on there. So, basically the way it shook out is that any film that we hadn't seen, all 3 of us, didn't actually make the list. I know there was one film that Anton hadn't actually watched, but he watched it.
But he's seen it now.
A few days ago, so he has seen it now. But it was like right at the
We've
tail
all seen
end.
the whole list.
I've seen it now. So everything on the list we've all seen now. Yeah. And I won't say what the film is. I'll let you all think about it. But I will say that I'm not unhappy that's on the list.
But so like I know, Anders, you had some Tarkovsky films in there that I haven't seen, and so it just completely fell off. Or Barry Lyndon from Kubrick, I haven't seen that. Well, I was surprised that a movie like Ordette didn't make it on Carl Theodor Dreiter's, and I didn't realize Anton hadn't seen it. So like, it's interesting how even though we constantly talk about movies and we discuss the site, but like me and Anders use Letterboxd a lot, and we all kind of have a running group text about movies we're watching and this, that, and the other. So we're pretty aware of what each other's into, but there's still certain things that I was a little bit surprised of, and I was like, oh, that's the silent movie you picked, or that's the Japan, like that's the Kurosawa you went with, or it's just it's interesting little idiosyncrasies, which I think is more reflected in the second 50, like 51 through 100. That's kind of where those are reflected, as opposed to the first 50, which is very much movies that we all hit.
And that's why you start to get some of the doubles in there, right? You start to get the repeated and certain films. But Anton,
Oh no, I was just gonna say, like, I think also if you just also want to speak about like the purpose of this list and how we're not trying to put out the list. There's a personal side to the list. It's not that we're saying that these films are just films that we like, and we're not asserting that they're great. We are sort of saying they're great films, but I think it's also a list that is very reflective of our own histories of watching film, of our own taste.
Absolutely. I think anytime people make a list, if they're making the list honest to themselves and not trying to like fill certain quotas, and there's reasons for doing that in different circumstances, but for this purpose, to make the Three Brothers top 100, this film is it lists both representative of films that we all think are great, that we all think are truly great films, but are also representative of the films that shaped us and our tastes.
Yeah, and I think there's sometimes a question that comes out, and like my wife was even asking me this when we were building out these lists, and she's like, what's the difference between your favorite movie and the movies you think are best? And I'm trying not to sound like a snob and be like, well, I think my favorite movies are the best movies, but trying to communicate that like this is not the movies I'm most comfortable with necessarily, or the cozy films. It's not. I've watched Star Wars: The Force Awakens like a dozen times. It's not sniffing this list, but I'm so fond of Star Wars, so I revisit that kind of thing. But something like Revenge of the Sith or Return of the Jedi gets on here just in the same. If this was just a list of like the films I have the most fun with, there'd be like Dumb and Dumber and Step Brothers and Batman vs Superman and weird movies that like, I think those movies are good, and it's not like it's like I'm trying to keep guilty pleasures or things like that off, even though I don't really believe in those. It's just I think we all respect our own interest in film enough to not shortchange the movies that we actually are passionate about. Where it's like, there's movies I care about, but they wouldn't make the 100.
Yeah, and like once I got into, got serious about film and started watching stuff, I kept coming up with this question where people would be like, okay, like what are your favorite movies? And when I mentioned Star Wars, people would be like, well, that's just like a movie you like and you watched as a kid and had a good experience. But like, what are the ones you actually think are the best? And, as I've argued in some of my writing on Star Wars, I was like, well, there's a deeply personal side for my love for Star Wars, but I actually think it is a great film, and here's like the formal reasons why and other reasons. And another good example of this is, so number 43, perhaps controversial, Roadhouse. So Aaron and I, the first time I saw Roadhouse, I was like, that's fun. I don't think it's a good movie. Or like, like a soft positive. Yeah. I think I gave it a 6 the very first time I watched it. And then Aaron and I have watched it in Anders, like again and again.
I've become
and
convinced.
I'm like, no, this is the best 80s action film.
And that's the thing, right? Because my personal biography, if I'm drawn to a film so much, at a certain point I have to ask myself, why is it that I feel that way about it? Like a film that didn't make even the top 100, but that I had nominated was John Frankenheimer's Ronin. And it's a film that the first time I saw it, I liked it. I didn't love it. But I kept coming back to it over the last 20 years. And I'm like, I think this is one of the best post-Cold War thrillers. It has some of the best car chases I've ever seen. It's formally, the script is amazing. The performances are great. I'm like, it's a great film. I don't have to qualify that.
Is it I didn't vote to put it on this list, but I would say maybe as one of the best, maybe the best car
It's up
chase.
there, Frank.
Have you seen Bullet?
I actually haven't seen Bullet,
The movie
but
Bullet's not like a great
that
movie,
is
but
a
it's got a
better
great car
purchase.
chase.
Yeah.
But no, the Ronin one, the backwards driving is pretty exceptional.
But at least we got a Frankenheimer on the list as Manchurian Candidate. So.
It's true. And here's the other thing, right? It's like this list is indicative of the age we grew up in, the films, the first formative great films that we discovered that led us to other avenues. So you can find themes in this list. You can find genre overlaps. The fact that like Bond movies are on here, and we grew up watching Bond movies, but we weren't the biggest Bond heads. We liked Star Trek.
Yeah,
and,
we actually came to
and
it a
Star
little bit
Wars and
later.
Indiana Jones more in Jurassic Park. Like Bond movies were something we explored because they were considered important action movies in the history of cinema, and we started to be like, okay, there's something here. These are good movies, and we started to investigate them more. And especially I think in 2015 when we did our retrospective, we really started to nail on like, no, these are really indicative of not only the genre but of just like that classical Hollywood
Cinema
filmmaking, especially the early Connery ones and some of the key Craig ones would show up on this list.
Well, and I think you'll see a similar thing going on with I think we have five Disney movies on here, correct?
Yeah.
So first is Pinocchio,
Fantasia,
Fantasia,
Lion King, Beauty and the Beast, and Snow White.
We have two Disney Renaissance, 3 from the classical period, and so I think someone will observe. They'll be like, "Well, you don't have any Pixar movies on here," and we were talking about this when we were putting the list together, and we were sort of saying that, you know what, like the other day I watched Snow White with my boys, and I was like, there's fascinating stuff going on in this. Like, it is a great film. There's this strange expressionist scene when she's running in the forest, the strange like castle in the castle in the sky at the very end of the movie, where the prince lives. Like, there's some very bold imagery there, and it moves the film works on a level that I feel like even Pixar, like my favorite Pixars, I'll think are really, really good and really like them, but they don't seem to have the same almost like strangeness going on to really make me want to put it on the list.
Yes, that's it. Snow White is not conventional, actually. Ironically, for the very first feature-length animation, because I just rewatched it last fall as well. There's weird digressions. The pacing, there's like long sequences of like the dwarves doing silly, funny things, right? So I think you're right. I think it's that it lacks that idiosyncratic touch. That the Pixar movies, as great as they are, sometimes feel like filmed by committee.
I agree with that in the sense Pixar, I think I was saying this the other day when we were just hashing over some ideas, which is Pixar movies are very good and can be excellent in like for children's entertainment, but they never ever transcend that. However much I like the Toy Story movies or the Incredibles movies, they're very good. I'm not trying to like denigrate them or anything. It's just they do have that kind of, they're the best thing that a product can be, as like a film as product. And I think that's one of the things on this list. I don't think there's anything on here that you could say is purely a product. I think the closest would be the Bond movies. And I think the specific Bond movies that we pick out are the ones that are most idiosyncratic or have a specific creative vision driving it, whether it's Connery as an actor, whether it's the kind of thematic interest of the whole series in Skyfall. But like, so just quickly jumping to the Disney thing, those early Disney movies, Pinocchio, Snow White, Fantasia, they're very clearly the vision of Walt Disney.
Yeah, even though he didn't direct,
but they're still like they are the result of one unified vision, even if it's like a whole team doing that. But they have the artist's touch to, like, quote unquote. It's just however much I like Pixar and however much I like some Marvel movies and the new Star Wars movies, I really like those, but they don't get the level that the prequels get or the old ones get, where it's like, no, this has the complexities and rough edges that I actually think are necessary for some great works of art.
I think that's a good point, that some people actually sometimes feel it the other way, right? Like they don't like those rough edges or the oddness of some movies. But I actually wonder, I mean, maybe something to talk about, not on this podcast, but like computer animation, I think sometimes I do wonder whether it lacks that handmade touch. I don't know. Do you want to talk about the fact that we have 6 Spielberg films on here?
7?
7?
I think it's 7.
I think there's 7 Spielbergs. Yeah, so we've mentioned the 5 Disney, 4 Bonds, 7 Spielbergs. And you'll go through the list, you'll notice, there's 4 Star Wars movies, so episodes 4, 5, and 6, and episode 3. How many Scorseses do we have on here?
I think
Goodfellas,
3?
Raging Bull.
Goodfellas.
We have 4 Miyazakis.
4 Miyazaki, yeah.
So, I think it's kind of clear that Spielberg is the 7. He's the one who if this is the list of, in some sense, the, classical Hollywood style, the, film as narrative art, but also entertainment, Spielberg kind of...
And the movie Brat generation.
Yeah, but Spielberg embodies that the most of any director.
And what you'll see, what I found interesting, and one of the reasons actually why the methodology we chose wound up on having, say, 7 Spielbergs and 3 or 4 of a lot of the directors we really like, is the fact that even though we're all huge fans of Spielberg, or we're all now very big into Bond, which of those works are our very favorite, we tend to disagree on. And so but we all like all of their works. So
Yeah.
what that did is that caused, I think that's why there's four Bonds on here. If someone was make a list of 100 greatest films, I'd probably be like, yeah, so there should probably be maybe 2 Bonds on here. But because, my favorite Bond movies are Casino Royale and From Russia with Love, and I think From Russia with Love is maybe the most consensus of ours. And then Aaron's is Skyfall.
Yeah, Skyfall and Goldfinger are my favorite.
I had From
Goldfinger.
Russia with Love and Goldfinger on
Yeah.
my nomination of 100.
Okay, so, that's the reason why there's 4 on there. Because our very favorites, which we would give, a 5 or a 6 on our ranking system.
Same with
would go up there.
Spielberg.
Same thing with Spielberg, The number 2 is probably, is it all of our favorites?
It's my
Spielberg
favorite.
Raiders? Would we all agree? Yeah, I'd say that, or no, it probably is my favorite.
It probably is. It's that or Minority Report for me.
Yeah.
And it depends on the day.
But then, Anders was passionate about E.T. for the list. I still think E.T.'s, a 10 out of 10 masterpiece, but I originally didn't have it on my nomination list. And so that's how some of these directors sort of accrued quite a few on here. And it was interesting to see what ones we came closest. Seven Samurai for Kurosawa. It's hard not to pick that. I think almost any film buff out there will be like, yeah, Seven Samurai.
Yeah. And then what was our second one, right? I think I had Rashomon as the second. My second.
Yeah, and I had Ran, the King Lear.
Well, I had Dursu Uzala, which neither of you guys have seen.
Yeah, I know. That's one of the few
I had Ran
Kurosawas
on
I
my
haven't
list
seen.
as well. And Rashomon, Yojimbo, Ikaru are all movies that I think are great, but they're they're just off the list for me, but because I think they're great, if you guys put them on, I would still vote them highly.
Yep, exactly. That's what happened in a lot of cases with films that you guys chose that I didn't necessarily nominate in my 100.
In terms of genre,
I think that shows also the difficulty, right?
Well, I was just going to say, in terms of genre, we could also just quickly comment. We see that there's a strong interest in science fiction, but it's interesting to see. I think later on, if we wanted to work out some lists around something we don't often talk about perhaps as much, but comedies. So things like Rushmore. We're all a huge fan of Wes Anderson. I think all of us like Rushmore best. This is Spinal Tap as being maybe the funniest movie of all time. I still it's so laugh out loud. I just die when I watch it.
Oh, it's perfect. It's sublime, actually, with how funny it is. I mentioned this, when we were kind of just going back and forth, which was I almost wish there were more comedies on the list. But comedy and horror are the 2 genres that are the hardest for people to unify on because they have such a personalized reaction to them.
Yeah.
So horror is the other thing that on the site we've started really digging into with our Halloween horror. And I've made a point of, it went from being I'm a huge scaredy cat and just don't like watching horror movies because they scare me too much to I'm going to face this head on and I love horror movies. I watch so many of them. They're one of my favorite genres.
Yeah, no, I always want the daytime edit.
And I ended up liking horror enough to be asked to teach a horror film class, so that really even it's kind of become something I've really been into, and noting also the overlaps between horror and science fiction, because I think some of my favorite horror films are sci-fi horror, so Alien and The Thing both made the list. So.
But that's the thing. I'm glad that we have some horror movies on this list. Psycho's our number 5. So horror movies in the top
Yeah.
10, and you have The Shining and The Thing and Alien in there. And I know we individually, some of us had different, like Silence of the Lambs. That's horror as well. That's later on the list.
serial killer horror.
I also pushed for Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and it's a movie that I've come to more recently, but it's like it looms so large. And
Yeah, and the horror film that I wanted Night of the Living Dead on there, but
well, and I was tempted to have It Follows, but I know you guys wouldn't go for it at all. So
On comedy, I would just say that, like, you know, for me personally, what I'd also sort of say is that, like, we have a bit of a range of comedy on here too, which I like. We have The General, coming in at number 10, so some of the great slapstick. But sometimes, like, comedy versus humor, and some of my favorite humorous moments in movies are actually not always just in comedies. Like, like some of the little jokes and stuff that I'll come back to again and again are just like, they sometimes show up in like movies that you wouldn't describe as a comedy. Like the way like some of Sean Connery's quips is Dr. Jones and The Last Crusade, like things like that I just find really funny and I'll have a big laugh at. Like it's not a comedy.
one of the films I've laughed the most at in the last like long little while, like few months, was rewatching American Psycho.
oh yeah,
Which is on our list, and
It's a comedy.
I think it's a dark comedy.
Yep.
and
Pitch
it's
Black.
Same
also
thing with
a
Dr.
Canadian film.
Strangelove, right? So we have another dark comedy there.
If you can't laugh at the excesses of serial killer Wall Street guys and nuclear war, I mean, what can you not laugh at?
Is there anything you wanted to pick out that you were like, why wasn't this on here? Is there anything you want to alert people? Alert people listening, be like, you know what? Like, I just don't get why this didn't show up at the end of the day.
Well, I understand why I didn't, but I have Mirror is turned into Tarkovsky's Mirror is probably one of my 10 favorite films at this point. The number of times I've watched
You're
it,
a
how
big
much I love it.
Tarkovsky
But I love
guy, and you're
Tarkovsky.
someone who studies
and to
Tarkovsky.
me, I think I had 2 Tarkovskys even nominated, and none of them made it. So I think Tarkovsky is the biggest omission for me.
so I made comment, which is the biggest omission is some core directors, which I think we all admit are great, but they don't have anything on here. I think having no James Cameron is a little bit like, I find it an omission. The fact that T2 is not on here, I know you guys don't go for Titanic to the level that I do, but T2 as this just like sublime action movie,
I vetoed Titanic. I'm sorry, Aaron.
it's fine because
Knocked it down in the vote.
it's such a pure it takes a certain kind of an emotionality for you to latch onto such a film like that. But I think the people who love Titanic very much love it. So I'm one of those people. But so James Cameron movies. Anders, you love Tarkovsky personally. I really love Bergman, but Anton and we have a few Bergmans on here, but Anton hasn't seen
I
beyond
haven't seen them all.
the ones on here.
Yeah, I haven't really seen beyond the ones on here.
So, there's no, Fanny Alexander or Cries and Whispers. And I said Ordette as another movie that it's just not enough people have seen to get on here. I think the biggest, so I'd say the biggest genre that we're missing is Kung Fu movies. And I know Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon's on here, but that's a wuxia epic, and I don't really count it the same as like a Jackie Chan film or one of those Hong Kong movies from the 80s, 90s.
But again, we split on which Jackie Chan we nominated, Aaron.
It's true, because you picked Police Story, which I agree is amazing, but Legend of Drunken Master is a comedy too. That's the thing, and I know Police Story is very funny.
Police Story is hilarious.
But Drunken Master is like a straight comedy too. That's the thing.
I feel like I'd have to rewatch. Like, it's been so long since I saw Drunken Master.
To be fair, I did watch Drunken Master with Jackie Chan in attendance, so it looms a bit large over my mind. But the
special.
director that I find a little bit curious that he's not on here is Kieslowski. And I get that it's partially because his greatest work is a TV work. It's Decalogue, which isn't...
Which we talked about that we didn't have a lot of strong rules about what was on the list, but we did talk about, something like the Decalogue. And we said we're going to count it as like a TV
series, yeah.
series. So we didn't.
And we didn't said no short films.
And we said also no
Yeah.
short films, because otherwise there's a few short films I would have picked to go on here.
Like Duck Amuck or Night and Fog, things like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe one of the Superman.
Yeah, one of the Max
early
Fleischer.
ones. Yeah.
But so
which I adore.
Kieslowski's one of the, like, if I'm being perfectly honest looking at this list right now, the film that I think is far and away too high is Tree of Life.
But I'm glad. What I'm
And
glad.
I really love it, but it was like lower down on my list, and it's just the fact that it's probably it's the only film of the last decade to get in the top 25 And I do agree it's great, but it's just picking that transcendence over Kozlowski or over Dreyer. I'm just like, no, I want a little bit more
I'm
of those.
glad we have that skewed, and I like, I feel like we don't have actually a lot of recent films. So part of me, that's why I like having it on the list and also ranking highly, because there's a few other recent films that I'm like, I feel like in a few years we might come back to and wonder if it's on here, like Blade Runner 2049 or something.
Anton, have you seen Grave of the Fireflies?
I haven't.
Okay, so that would explain that.
Otherwise, it would probably be
Anders,
on
you
it.
didn't.
Yeah, probably.
You didn't. And only yesterday you haven't seen either, right? So.
No, I haven't seen that one.
Yeah, I like both those a lot, but they're on the bubble.
Because that's kind of the thing with me, and I think with you, Anders, a bit. Which, if we had personal things of like what one, whether it's Disney, whether it's Bond, would like fill out the most entries. I know on my personal list it would be Ghibli movies. I feel like if maybe we just all seen those, there would have been a higher chance of having those be the most entries as opposed to Spielberg. Which I think that's just a shifting of some taste over time, and not even taste. It's just what we have latched onto more as over the years.
Mm-hmm.
One thing I'll say I think should be on the list is I actually think Sound of Music should be on the list. And I know you guys prefer West Side Story, but this will be for another day. But I actually think Julie Andrews' performance is maybe the best, one of the best performances of all time. Like maybe the best female performance in a movie.
Have you seen Double Life of Veronique?
It's pretty great.
It's 2 performances, price of 1.
I need to rewatch it though. It's been about a decade since I watched it.
Do we have one? We have one musical. Is West Side
Singing in the
Story?
Rain.
Or
We have
no, I
Singing
guess
in the
the
Rain.
Disney. We have Disney.
Singing in the Rain.
We have Singing in the Rain.
I had Singing in the Rain in my top 25.
I
all
do
time,
really
so-
like that movie.
Oh, you do?
I-
It's up in the 25.
Yeah, because I've just rewatched it so many times, and I've
I
taught
like
it.
I'm a Sound of Music over Singing in the Rain.
So the musicals that were just outside the list for me, and I don't think either of you guys have seen them, are the 1930s Fred Astaire, Ginger Rogers ones, like Swing Time and Top Hat.
No, I actually
And I
haven't.
find those so sublime.
Fred Astaire's a gap for me for sure.
This is the kind of exercise which it's fruitful for discussion of us understanding our own
Blind spots,
journeys
too.
as cinephiles, but blind spots, and also encouraging each other to seek out things. And I think
Exactly.
there's a possibility of more lists, not necessarily like top hundreds, but of whether it's genre list or national cinema lists or decades lists coming out in the future, because I think it's an opportunity for us to take stock and kind of reset the deck and be like, okay, maybe check out these movies because
Yeah.
we're clearly lacking some things on here.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah, and there's a lot of films that I just haven't also watched in a long time, and I want to revisit. Like I actually did rewatch Sound of Music last week, and I agree it's really good. I also recently watched West Side Story, and I'm like, I think for me what puts West Side Story over the top is again the dancing, and the music.
The music is better.
complex
And I actually think
choreography.
Bernstein and Sondheim is better. than
Sondheim's
Hamilton.
lyrics are so good. That's the thing. And I know Sound of Music is a children's film, Anton, as you said in our plumber thing. That's why it works so well. It's just West Side Story is like the perfect synthesis of highbrow, lowbrow musical in a sense.
I would also note, I think with the other thing, talking about blind spots, all of us are fairly, we've watched pretty widely in terms of, global cinema, but you can tell from our list, most of the, not US, not UK on here. We actually have probably more East Asian cinema than we even have European cinema potentially
so.
on here with all the Miyazakis and stuff. But part of that reflects just the sort of our fascinations, and also I lived in Korea for a year. My interest in East Asia has always been strong. So I feel like in some of the global cinema I've tended to watch in that direction. But I'm also wanting to expand, right? There's films that I haven't seen that I definitely need to check out in the world cinema.
I will say for me, obviously East Asian cinema is an area of interest both academically, and I lived in Asia. I've written on it. I've taught courses on Hong Kong cinema and East Asian cinema. But the biggest blind spot for me is Indian cinema. I really don't know Bollywood. I don't really know much about it. I haven't really seen much beyond Patha Panchali.
Yeah.
No, that's hugely.
Which I think was probably close to be on this list. Though.
No, it's true. I put it on my initial list. I know it probably was pretty high, but it's probably just on the cusp. Yeah, it's just like acknowledging. That's the whole thing, right? It's film spotting always says it so correctly, which is you present it as your top films, or you present it as your it's your personal canon, but it's your pantheon. and that's how they discuss it. And so nobody can ever quibble about you putting a film in your pantheon, so long as you're willing to like defend it, right?
Yeah, and
so that's the whole thing with this. It's these are films we can all go to bat for and defend why they're on this. And it doesn't mean that something that's not, it doesn't mean that something that's not on this list doesn't deserve to be here, or there's not a conversation to be had. If anything, the conversation is started because we made the list.
Exactly. It's a starting place, not a finality, right? And I could see us coming back in 10 years and doing this list and it being slightly different.
I'd love to hear from our readers and listeners about like, what are some of the points of, like where you're like, I don't know why that's on the list, and then also why didn't you think about
let us know,
this?
please.
Some pushback would be great, because again, and I think we're all happy to, there's nothing. I think you're right. Like there's nothing on this list that I wouldn't have a case that I could try to make, but I'm also open to aware of my blind spots, and I think there's so many movies still to watch, even though we've seen a lot.
That's what's great about movies.
We could do this for 2 hours more, so.
We totally could. But what I'm going to encourage you as a listener to do is a couple things, which is, 1, tell us the movies that you would put it on here that aren't on here. 2, tell us the movies that you're annoyed that we have on here. And 3, watch the films that you haven't seen that are on here. Because that's the ultimate kind of thing that I want, which is like, if you are curious as to why JFK is on here at number 53, go put it on and give yourself a wild ride for 3 hours and then come back and we'll have a conversation about it. Because there are aspects about all these films that we appreciate and we put it on here that aren't always the same reason, right? We're not approaching everything with one kind of blanket list of what it needs to meet to get onto this list. It's a various idiosyncrasies, it's various formal approaches, it's different emotional ways of moving us, whether it's a laugh to scare us. The ultimate thing is that these movies are worth talking about and, more importantly, worth watching. So please watch them.
And I think something we said earlier, that point of like lists as a starting point, right? Not as the end point, but as a starting point. And I remember looking at those AFI lists or Sight and Sound lists, and so hopefully this can be, whether you like this list, hate it, hopefully this is a starting point, something that you can use to go see some more great movies.
Thank you for a very enjoyable game.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you.